Over the skies of Germany, March 15, 1945, at an altitude of 25,000 feet, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber watched through his binoculars as another formation of American bombers approached. The morning sun glinted off hundreds of aluminum fuselages, and he allowed himself a slight smile. After 3 years of aerial combat, Weber had seen enough American bombing raids to recognize their patterns, their limitations, their predictable mistakes. The young Luftwaffe officer turned to his radar operator and said with casual confidence that these Americans, despite their overwhelming numbers, still could not hit what they aimed at with any real precision. He had no idea that within 2 hours, everything he believed about American capabilities would be shattered beyond recognition. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one German officer's certainty about American incompetence transformed into stunned disbelief, and how a single mission would demonstrate that the United States had quietly revolutionized the very nature of aerial warfare. Friedrich Weber was not an ordinary observer. At 31 years old, he commanded a flak observation post near the industrial city of Essen, and his credentials were impressive. He had studied mechanical engineering at the University of Berlin before the conflict began, served in the Spanish campaign, and spent 18 months on the Eastern Front before transferring to air defense operations in the West. His post maintained detailed logs of every raid, every pattern, every result. The leather-bound notebooks in his command bunker contained meticulous records going back to 1943, filled with calculations, diagrams, and observations that painted a clear picture in his mind. The Americans, Weber had concluded, were simply not good at precision targeting. He had the data to prove it. In a raid on February 8th against the railroad marshalling yards at Hamm, over 200 bombers had dropped more than 500 tons of explosives, and yet the main junction remained operational within 48 hours. On January 22nd, a massive formation had attempted to destroy the synthetic oil plant at Gelsenkirchen. Weber's own damage assessment showed that less than 15% of the bombs had landed within the target area. The rest had fallen across residential districts, farms and empty fields, creating massive craters but accomplishing little of strategic value. His counterpart at the neighboring observation post, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, shared these assessments. Richter was younger, only 26, but he brought a statistician's mind to their work. Together, they had calculated that American bombing accuracy averaged approximately 1,000 feet from the intended target point, under ideal conditions. When cloud cover forced the bombers to rely on radar aiming, that figure ballooned to over a mile. These were not opinions, Weber insisted. These were facts derived from hundreds of documented raids. On that March morning, Weber stood in his reinforced concrete observation tower, with Richter and 3 other officers, watching the latest American formation assemble over the North Sea. Through the stereoscopic rangefinders, they could count the bombers as they formed up into their combat boxes. Weber noted the formations in his log, approximately 375 heavy bombers, likely Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators, approaching from the northwest at an altitude between 23 and 26,000 feet. The target, according to intercepted communications, was the Krupp industrial complex in Essen. Weber almost laughed. The Krupp works sprawled across several square miles, a labyrinth of factories, warehouses, rail lines, and administrative buildings. The Americans had targeted it more than 20 times since 1943. Each time, damage had been moderate at best. The complex was simply too large, too dispersed, and too difficult to hit with the kind of accuracy required to truly cripple it. Repair crews had become so efficient that production interruptions rarely lasted more than a week. Weber's radar operator, Feldwebel Hermann Schulz, called out the bomber stream's progress. They were crossing the border now, their fighter escorts forming a protective screen above and to the flanks. Weber could see the contrails stretching across the sky like chalk lines on a blue slate. He ordered his crews to prepare to log the bombing run, just as they had done countless times before. His expectation was routine. The Americans would drop their payloads from high altitude, most bombs would miss the critical targets, and by tomorrow morning, he would add another entry to his notebooks documenting their continued ineffectiveness. What Weber did not know was that this raid was fundamentally different from every previous mission. In the lead bombardier's position of the Pathfinder aircraft, First Lieutenant James Mitchell from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was preparing to use a device that would change aerial warfare forever. Mitchell was 23 years old, a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a degree in electrical engineering. He had been specifically selected for this mission because of his technical aptitude and his steady hands. In the cramped nose of his B-17, Mitchell hunched over a device that looked like a small television screen mounted in a metal housing. This was the Norden Mark 15 bomb sight, but this particular model had been modified with a revolutionary new component, a fully automated radar optical coupling system that had been tested in only a handful of combat missions. The Norden bomb sight itself was already a marvel of mechanical engineering. It contained approximately 2,000 precision parts, including gyroscopes, gears, and optical elements that allowed a bombardier to calculate the exact release point for bombs based on altitude, airspeed, wind drift, and the ballistic characteristics of the ordnance. In theory, a skilled operator could place a bomb within a 100-foot circle from an altitude of 20,000 feet. In practice, however, combat conditions made such accuracy nearly impossible. The new modification changed everything. It integrated radar mapping technology with the optical bomb sight, allowing the device to lock onto specific ground features even through cloud cover or smoke. More importantly, it incorporated an automatic pilot coupling that took control of the aircraft during the final bombing run, making minute adjustments that no human pilot could match. The system had been developed in absolute secrecy at a laboratory in New Mexico and had been deployed to only 12 lead bombardier crews in the entire European theater. Mitchell activated the system as his aircraft approached the initial point for the bombing run. The radar screen flickered to life, showing a ghostly image of the terrain below. He could see the Rhine River, the road networks, and the distinctive shape of the Krupp complex. Using a small control knob, he placed a targeting reticle over the central power plant, a building that intelligence had identified as critical to the entire operation. Once locked, the system took over. Down in his observation post, Weber watched through his binoculars as the bomber formation approached. He noted the time in his log, 9:47 in the morning. The sky was remarkably clear, with visibility exceeding 15 kilometers. Perfect conditions for observation. Though even in such weather, Weber expected the usual results. He turned to Richter and remarked that they should count how many bombs fell into the Stadtwald forest to the south, as that seemed to be where most American ordnance ended up during raids on Krupp. The lead aircraft's bomb bay doors opened. Weber could see them clearly at this distance. Then, with mechanical precision, the first bombs began to fall. He raised his binoculars, ready to track their descent and calculate the impact points. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first bomb struck the central power plant with devastating accuracy. The explosion was massive, sending a column of smoke and debris several hundred feet into the air. Before Weber could process what he was seeing, the second bomb hit the transformer station adjacent to the power plant. Then the third struck the main electrical substation. The fourth demolished the coal gasification building. The fifth, sixth, and seventh bombs walked across the steel foundry complex with such precision that it looked like someone was checking off targets on a list. Weber's hands began to tremble. He lowered the binoculars for a moment, then raised them again, certain he must be misunderstanding what he was witnessing. But there was no mistake. Bomb after bomb was striking exactly where it would cause maximum damage to the Krupp operation. The machine shops, the rail loading facilities, the administrative center that housed critical engineering documents, the warehouse district, the crane assembly yards. Each one was being systematically destroyed with an accuracy he had never seen in 3 years of observing American raids. Richter stood beside him, his mouth open in shock. The statistician in him was already running calculations that seemed impossible. The bombs were landing within 50 feet of optimal impact points. Some appeared to be hitting within 25 feet. This was not the pattern they had documented in hundreds of previous raids. This was something entirely different, something that should not have been possible from an altitude of 25,000 feet. The bombing run lasted 11 minutes. In that time, 375 heavy bombers dropped approximately 900 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs on the Krupp complex. Weber's staff frantically recorded impact points, but the results were so consistent that they began to doubt their own observations. When the last bomber turned away and the formations began their return flight to England, Weber and Richter climbed down from the observation tower and drove immediately to the impact site. The devastation was unlike anything Weber had seen from an American raid. The central power plant had been reduced to rubble. The transformer station was a twisted mass of metal. The steel foundries had collapsed, their roofs caved in by direct hits. Fires burned in dozens of locations, and the acrid smell of burning machinery filled the air. But what struck Weber most was the precision of the destruction. Buildings that were critical to production had been demolished. Buildings that were less important had been largely untouched. It was as if someone had studied detailed blueprints of the facility and then placed each bomb exactly where it would cause maximum disruption. In the wreckage of the power plant, Weber found the plant supervisor, Herr Dietrich Vogel, a 60-year-old engineer who had worked at Krupp for 37 years. Vogel's face was covered in soot, and his eyes held a look of disbelief. He told Weber that in all the previous raids his crews had always managed to restore basic power within 2 or 3 days. This time, he said, would be different. The Americans had destroyed not just the generators, but also the main transformers, the electrical distribution network, and the backup power systems. Repairing this damage would take months, not days. Perhaps it could not be repaired at all given the current shortage of specialized equipment. Weber returned to his observation post and spent the evening reviewing every page of notes from the raid. His hands still shook as he wrote. The numbers told a story that contradicted everything he had believed about American bombing capabilities. He calculated that approximately 68% of the bombs had struck within the Krupp complex boundaries. Of those, perhaps 80% had hit structures of significant value. This was not luck. This was not the result of simply dropping overwhelming quantities of explosives and hoping some would hit something important. This was precision targeting on a scale he had thought impossible. That night, Weber wrote a detailed report to his superiors at Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin. He described what he had witnessed and included his calculations. He concluded the report with a statement that he knew would sound alarmist, but that he believed was absolutely true. The Americans had developed a new bombing technology that changed everything. If they could replicate this accuracy consistently, no industrial target in Germany was safe, regardless of air defenses or weather conditions. The response from Berlin came 3 days later. Weber's commanding officer, General Major Kurt Steiner, arrived at the observation post personally. Steiner was 54 years old, a veteran of the First Great Conflict, and a man known for his pragmatism and his resistance to panic. He read Weber's report carefully, then asked to see the damage assessment photographs and the impact plots. Weber spread the materials across the command table. Steiner studied them in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, he looked up and said that Weber's analysis was either brilliant or insane, and he was not certain which. He asked whether Weber truly believed the Americans had achieved a breakthrough in bombing accuracy, or whether this had simply been an exceptionally lucky raid. Weber chose his words carefully. He explained that he had observed more than 400 American bombing missions. He understood the statistics of accuracy, the variables that affected bomb placement, the limitations of high-altitude bombing. What he had witnessed on March 15th was statistically impossible unless something fundamental had changed in American capabilities. He did not know what technology they had developed, but the evidence was undeniable. Steiner nodded slowly. He revealed that Weber was not the only observer reporting unusual accuracy in recent American raids. Similar reports had come from Cologne, Hamburg, and Munich. Intelligence officers were investigating whether the Americans had developed new guidance systems for their bombs or new sighting equipment for their bombardiers. He told Weber to continue monitoring and documenting every raid with meticulous detail. Over the following weeks, Weber witnessed 3 more American missions that demonstrated the same shocking accuracy. On March 23rd, bombers struck the submarine pens at Bremen, placing bombs directly into the ventilation shafts and destroying the internal facilities while leaving the massive concrete roof structures intact. On April 2nd, a raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt achieved direct hits on the precision grinding shops, while largely sparing the adjacent worker housing. On April 9th, American bombers demolished the railroad bridge at Remagen with such precision that the structure collapsed into the Rhine with minimal damage to the surrounding town. Each time, Weber added to his growing file of documentation. His notebooks filled with impact plots, damage assessments and calculations that all pointed to the same conclusion. American bombing had undergone a revolution in accuracy. The casual confidence he had felt just weeks earlier now seemed absurdly naive. In his quieter moments, Weber reflected on what this meant for the broader trajectory of the conflict. He had always believed that Germany's industrial capacity, despite being smaller than America's, could be protected through dispersal, hardening, and air defense. If critical facilities could survive bombing raids with moderate damage that could be quickly repaired, then production could continue even under sustained attack. But if the Americans could now destroy specific buildings, specific machines, specific power systems with precision, then no amount of dispersal or hardening would matter. They could simply systematically dismantle the industrial base, one crucial component at a time. The personal transformation that Weber underwent during those weeks was profound. He had prided himself on his analytical mind, his evidence-based approach, his resistance to propaganda from either side. Yet he had allowed his own assumptions and limited experience to blind him to the possibility that the enemy might innovate, might improve, might achieve breakthroughs that changed fundamental assumptions. The Americans he had dismissed as incompetent bombardiers had quietly developed technology that made his 3 years of careful observations largely obsolete. One afternoon in late April, Weber sat in his observation post with Richter, reviewing the latest intelligence summaries. Richter had been compiling data from observation posts across Western Germany, and the pattern was unmistakable. American bombing accuracy had improved dramatically across all target types and all weather conditions. The improvement was not gradual or incremental. It had appeared suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch and fundamentally changed the capabilities of the entire bomber force. Richter spread out a series of photographs on the table. They showed bomb damage from raids in January, February, and March. The January photos depicted the familiar pattern of scattered impacts, with most ordnance falling in fields or on structures of minimal importance. The February photos showed marginal improvement, but the March photos told a completely different story. Impact craters formed neat patterns centered on critical infrastructure. Factories had been systematically destroyed building by building. Transportation networks had been severed at precisely the right points to maximize disruption. Weber studied the images in silence. He thought about his engineering training, about the principles of probability and error distribution that should govern the placement of bombs dropped from high altitude through turbulent air. What he was seeing violated those principles. The only explanation was that the Americans had developed a way to remove or dramatically reduce the random variables that caused bombs to scatter, some kind of guidance system, some kind of computational device, some breakthrough that allowed them to achieve accuracy that had previously been impossible. The implications were staggering. If this technology could be applied consistently across the entire bomber force, then the strategic bombing campaign would become exponentially more effective. Instead of requiring hundreds of aircraft and thousands of bombs to destroy a single factory, the Americans could accomplish the same objective with a fraction of the resources. They could strike multiple targets simultaneously, systematically dismantling the industrial infrastructure that supported the German military. Weber also realized something else. The Americans had deployed this technology quietly, without fanfare or announcement. They had not boasted about their breakthrough or warned German forces that a new capability was coming. They had simply begun using it, allowing the results to speak for themselves. This suggested a level of operational security and strategic thinking that Weber had not previously attributed to American military planning. It also suggested that there might be other capabilities, other technologies that had not yet been revealed. By late April, as the conflict in Europe entered its final weeks, Weber's observation post had become a center for analyzing American bombing techniques. Officers from other units came to study his documentation, His reports were forwarded to technical intelligence sections that were trying to understand American capabilities before the inevitable conclusion of hostilities. Weber shared everything he had learned, though he knew it was too late to matter for the outcome of the conflict. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Within weeks, American intelligence teams were in Germany, interviewing military personnel and gathering information about German perceptions of Allied capabilities. Weber was interviewed by a young captain from Army intelligence named Robert Harrison, who spoke fluent German and seemed genuinely interested in Weber's observations. Harrison listened as Weber described the transformation he had witnessed in American bombing accuracy. He took notes, asked clarifying questions, and examined Weber's meticulously maintained notebooks. When Weber finished his account, Harrison sat quietly for a moment, then told him something that Weber had suspected, but not confirmed. The Americans had indeed developed a revolutionary new bombing system, Harrison explained, one that combined radar technology with automated computing and flight control. The system had been tested extensively before deployment and had been introduced gradually across bomber units, starting in late 1944. Harrison also told Weber something he had not known. The development of the technology had been driven in part by analysis of German industrial dispersal strategies. American planners had recognized that traditional area bombing was becoming less effective as German factories were spread across wider areas and protected by hardened structures. To defeat dispersal, they needed precision. The technology Weber had witnessed was the result of that requirement. Weber asked Harrison why the Americans had waited so long to deploy such a capability. Harrison smiled and explained that the technology had required years of development. The radar components alone had gone through dozens of iterations before becoming reliable enough for combat use. The computing mechanisms had required new manufacturing techniques and precision parts that did not exist at the start of the conflict. The integration of all the systems into a package that could function reliably at high altitude in extreme cold, while being subjected to anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks, had been an enormous engineering challenge. The conversation with Harrison gave Weber a new perspective on the conflict he had just lived through. The war had not been decided solely by courage, tactics, or even industrial capacity. It had been shaped profoundly by technological innovation, by the ability of different nations to develop new capabilities and deploy them effectively. The side that could innovate faster, adapt more quickly, and leverage new technologies more successfully had gained decisive advantages. Weber eventually returned to civilian life and resumed his engineering career, working for a manufacturing company in Munich. He never forgot the morning of March 15, 1945, when his carefully constructed understanding of American capabilities had been demolished as thoroughly as the Krupp power plant. In later years, when colleagues asked about his wartime experiences, he would sometimes tell the story of how he had laughed at American bombing accuracy, convinced by his own data that they were incompetent, only to witness technology that made his assumptions irrelevant. The experience shaped Weber's approach to his post-war work. He became known for his willingness to challenge established assumptions, his openness to unexpected innovations, and his insistence that competitors should never be underestimated. He kept his wartime notebooks in his office, occasionally showing them to younger engineers as a lesson about the dangers of certainty and the importance of remaining open to the possibility that the rules you think you understand might change suddenly and completely. The broader historical significance of the bombing accuracy revolution is difficult to overstate. In the early years of the air campaign over Europe, American daylight bombing raids suffered terrible casualties while achieving relatively modest results. The commitment to precision bombing, as opposed to the area bombing favored by other air forces, was questioned by many military leaders. Crews flew dangerous missions, knowing that most of their bombs would miss their intended targets by substantial margins. The psychological toll was enormous, and the strategic value was debatable. The development of automated bombing systems, radar guidance, and sophisticated computational aids transformed this equation. By early 1945, American bombers could destroy specific buildings within large industrial complexes, could strike transportation bottlenecks, with devastating effectiveness, and could systematically dismantle the infrastructure required for industrial war production. This capability, combined with overwhelming numerical superiority in aircraft production, made the strategic bombing campaign far more effective in its final months than in its first years. Post-war analysis revealed that German industrial production actually increased through much of 1944, despite sustained bombing, largely because damage could be repaired faster than it accumulated and because production could be dispersed to less vulnerable locations. Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, had developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining production even under sustained aerial attack. Factories were spread across multiple sites, critical machinery was moved underground, and repair crews became extraordinarily efficient at restoring damaged facilities. But in the first months of 1945, production in many critical sectors collapsed as precision bombing destroyed irreplaceable equipment, specialized facilities, and infrastructure nodes that could not be quickly rebuilt. The accuracy revolution that Weber witnessed was a crucial factor in this final industrial collapse. When every bomb could be expected to hit its target, dispersal strategies became far less effective. Underground facilities could still be reached if bombs could be placed precisely in ventilation shafts or access tunnels. Specialized machinery that had been painstakingly relocated could be destroyed in a single, accurate raid. For Friedrich Weber personally, the experience shaped his understanding of technological change and the danger of assumptions. In his post-war engineering work, he became an advocate for continuous innovation and for never assuming that current capabilities represented ultimate limits. He argued that organizations needed to anticipate technological breakthroughs from competitors and be prepared to adapt quickly when the rules changed. His colleagues sometimes found his warnings about complacency to be excessive, but those who knew his background understood where his insistence came from. The American crews who flew those precision missions in the final months of the European conflict often did not fully understand the impact of their improved accuracy. They knew their new equipment worked better than previous systems. Bombardiers like James Mitchell appreciated the technology they had been given, recognizing that it made their dangerous jobs somewhat less difficult and their missions more likely to succeed. But they rarely saw the ground-level devastation or understood how their precision was perceived by those who monitored their raids. For Mitchell and his fellow bombardiers, the missions remained terrifying despite the improved technology. Anti-aircraft fire still filled the sky with deadly fragments. German fighters still attacked when they could penetrate the escort screen. Aircraft still went down, crews still died, and the psychological strain of repeated combat missions remained intense. The better accuracy did not make them invulnerable. It simply made their sacrifices more strategically valuable. But for officers like Weber and Richter, who had spent years documenting and analyzing American raids, the transformation was shocking and undeniable. The Americans they had dismissed, the bombardiers they had mocked for their inability to hit what they aimed at, had achieved something that seemed to violate the established rules of aerial warfare. It was a humbling lesson in the speed of technological progress and the danger of underestimating an adversary's capacity for innovation. Weber lived until 1987, passing away at the age of 73. In his final years, he witnessed the development of precision-guided munitions that made even the advanced systems of 1945 seem primitive by comparison. Laser-guided bombs, satellite navigation, and computer-controlled delivery systems achieved accuracy that would have seemed like science fiction during his wartime service. Yet he recognized the fundamental principle remained the same. Technological innovation could transform warfare suddenly and completely, making yesterday's certainties obsolete. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.